Hello students from Vechta, students from Gävle in Sweden. This is the third of our presentations, thinking about poverty, thinking about inequality, and we're zooming in now on the case of poverty in the global north. And I'll be thinking a lot about Britain in the course of this presentation. Like of the previous ones, watch this with a friend on the phone so that you can pause and natter about my discussion points by questions. Good, maybe I should give the context for my own interest in this topic. It was when I was your age, in my early 20s. I just finished a degree and I was doing a gap year of volunteering. Not uncommon in England or America. And I was working with homeless people and also working with disabled people. And when I was working with disabled people, one of my colleagues actually asked me why I was volunteering, why was I doing this for a whole year? And I said to him, I gave that classic, slightly cliched answer, it's nice to give something back to society, you know, having had the chance to study, having had that privilege, it's nice to give something back in return. And he nodded and he added, I guess it's also interesting to see how the other half live. And I was a little bit perplexed, I didn't know what to say. He was assumed that I was middle class. Actually, I'm not. But it's a fascinating point, isn't it? We have such a diversity in our society. Some people are privileged, some people much less so. And that's going to be our theme, thinking about the case of Britain, for the last two of my talks. Good. We had a very, very interesting definition of relative poverty by Peter Townsend. This was a late 1970s definition. Can you remember any bits of it? Just press pause and just scratch your heads for a few seconds, because it was filled with really interesting ideas. That classic, well-cited 1979 definition of relative poverty. Individuals, families, and groups in the population can be said to be in poverty when they lack the resources to obtain the types of diet, participate in the activities, and have the living conditions and the amenities which are customary, or at least wildly encouraged or approved in the societies to which they belong. So the idea here is really quite a simple one. In our societies, we have norms, we have expectations, we have things which people are typically able to do. And if people don't have access to those opportunities, we can see them as being in poverty, in relative poverty. My next question is, of course, which things, you know, which goods, which services, which life conditions, which belongings are we talking about here? So think about the norms in our society. Obviously, you're in 2020 now, in terms of the services, in terms of the life conditions, in terms of the belongings which we have, which we enjoy. My question for you in a concrete sense, what concrete things, what specific services could Townsend be thinking of for the case of your country today? Now, he was thinking obviously of the case of Britain in the 1970s. I'll talk more about that in a few moments. But what about you for your country today? Think about your life, you know, a student, a typical citizen, so to say. My photo here illustrates my thoughts about this topic. Something like 10 or 11 years ago, I was teaching in the States. It was actually my first time ever teaching there. And I was invited to give a talk on poverty because it was their topic that particular week. I gave Townsend's definition. I was doing the presentation on my own private laptop. And back in 2008, 2009, laptops were horribly expensive things. They cost a lot of money. And if you didn't have a lot of money, the simple alternative would be to have a second-hand laptop. And I had a wonderfully old second-hand laptop. It wasn't quite as old as the 1995 model you have there in the picture, but it was, I think, only something like 4 years younger. I think it was a very, very late 90s laptop, still working very nicely, a bit slow, but working fine 10 years later. And I said to my students, you know, the latest computer is obviously a luxury, but access to some kind of second-hand laptop or PC, for me, that would be an example of a norm. If I didn't have that access, then in some sense, I'm living in relative poverty. And my American students were really quite perplexed. They found that quite a strict definition, so to say, but it's the kind of thinking that I want from you guys. For me, back then, as today, you know, the laptop, even if it's an old second-hand shabby one, is a real basic which everybody must have. And you could powerfully argue that an adult should be able to have access to, say, a smartphone. You know, as a student, you'll probably need it for your studies. So that would be maybe a modern equivalent to that. And it goes without saying, of course, in Townsend's time when he was considering this back in the 1970s, there would obviously have been other norms, other belongings, other services, which was seen as being standard. So that's it with your friend. What things here really would be examples of the basics which we can be expected to have, expected to enjoy. Pause here. Yeah, what did you come up with? Well, it's really quite fascinating to compare your points, your 2020 points, with Townsend's list, which he put together 41 years ago. Have a look at this. I find this really, really fascinating. Now, the context here is Britain in 1979. I can remember this. I grew up in Britain in the 1970s. I can tell you a nice anecdote. I was watching a music film. It was a biopic. It was a film based on a British band of the 1970s, and the film's called Control. Highly recommended. On the making of, the filmmaker, who was a Dutch photographer in the 70s, he talked about when he came to Britain in the late 1970s, lived in working class industrial cities like Manchester. And he said, coming from the Netherlands, it really was quite a shock to see how the British poor lived. You know, his interpretation was that the levels of inequality, the levels of poverty, were probably higher in Britain back then compared to what he was used to from his home country. And that thought that he mentioned, that stayed in my mind. I think that is descriptive. You have to kind of relocate yourself in time and in space. So that kind of society, a society characterized by a working class that had gotten used to inequality, that's our context for Britain in the 1970s. Here's some of Townsend's original points. There's more. I've just selected a few. You'll find the full list on page 534 of this edition of Giddens and Sutton's textbook. Has not had a holiday away from home in the last 12 months. So the idea is that in a society like Germany or Britain, you would be expected to have the opportunity to have a holiday, you know, travel, a summer holiday once a year at least. That would be customary, that would be typical. Number two, adults only, has not had a relative or a friend to the home for a meal or a snack in the past 4 weeks. So having the friend over, enjoying a meal with a friend. Children only, has not had a friend to play or to tea in the past 4 weeks. Once again, we're stressing the normality of children and adults visiting each other, you know, offering each other refreshments, that kind of basic thing. Children only, did not have a party on the last birthday. So once again, an example where, you know, children will expect a birthday party, and it really is living in poverty if parents cannot afford to throw a birthday party. If you are in your early 20s and you're not a parent, it goes without saying, it's great fun to think about how much a birthday party costs. A nice task for you to do after this video is to work it out in your head, you know, what are the typical total costs of, say, a birthday party for an 8-year-old or a 12-year-old. Check with a parent friend. You'll be quite shocked at the numbers. Next point, does the person not have fresh meat, including meals out, as many as 4 days a week? So the Brits in the 70s were very much carnivores, and that would be seen as being a norm, you know, to have, you know, burgers and sausages and all of that kind of thing. Has gone through 1 or more days in the past fortnight without a cooked meal. Again, this would have been an example for the Brits' lifestyles of the 1970s. So you can see this is the kind of thing that Townsend was thinking of, and we have to translate it a little bit to 41 years later, but maybe we can still relate to the feeling of these points that he's listing there. Good. So he's actually got quite a complex way of measuring whether somebody's in poverty. This is really quite subtle. He's taking time to investigate somebody's life, their everyday experiences, their routines, in a sense, their biography, and measure it in quite a nuanced way. This is obviously a very accurate indication of whether somebody's in relative poverty or not. Cruder approaches, once again, we have options if we want to be a little bit more simplified in our thinking. One numerical concept that you have is the poverty line. That's what I want to talk about now. A much simpler way of assessing whether somebody is living in relative poverty is comparing their income to the average incomes within the population. So how does this person's income relate to the average income in that particular society? There's various ways of doing this. A common definition for relative poverty is when a person's income is under 60% of the median income in the population, under 60%. But I've seen variants of this. You could take a 50% line, and you could even have a percentage higher than 60. Obviously, there's different ways of measuring the extent of somebody's poverty, but 60 is typical. The graph I'm going to give you in a minute is actually measured in a slightly different way, but the ranking, so to say, is probably very, very comparable to this basic 60% calculation. So I'm going to show you a table. It's going to compare lots of different countries. Before I show it to you, just stop for a minute and with your partner, your colleague, natter. And my next question for you is this one here. Which countries do you think have lots of people living in this relative poverty? Okay, which countries are very much characterized by relative poverty? Which countries have only very few people living in relative poverty? Some countries have policies to keep this really down to the absolute minimum. So you're going to see diversity, which ones are at which end of the spectrum. Well, you can unpause now. Here is my table. As I said, a slightly different calculation to my 60% example. Here we're not taking their total income, we're looking at their disposable income. 50% of the median equivalized disposable income. This table also has a gender separation. But have a look at it, it's really, really fascinating. What do we see when we look at that? We might be looking for our countries. Britain is actually somewhere in the middle of this selection of countries. Some countries are notable for being at one or the other end of the spectrum. A number of the poorer countries we might expect to have a lot of inequality, Brazil, for example. But isn't it fascinating to see the very affluent country of the United States, actually number 15, I think it was, on the Human Development Index, being so bad, you know, at the wrong end of this table with relatively very high levels of relative poverty. So the position of the states there quite near to the right end of this ranking is really quite disturbing. And again, if you look at the left end of the ranking, looking at those countries which have very little relative poverty, some of them have really quite spectacular statistics. So we notice a cluster of the Nordic countries that all have very low levels of this relative poverty. The explanation there is, of course, quite simple, isn't it? Isn't it? It is, isn't it? It's worth noting, to some extent, the governments of these countries will be choosing what levels of relative poverty they want. If they consider it to be a political priority to fight it, a political priority of the electorate, of the voters, so to say, they will. And the Nordic countries have had quite aggressive social policy, really battling with poverty, and over generations, not just decades, but over generations. And I'm guessing that would be a simple explanation as to why they have such low levels. They have low levels because their voters just don't want it. And the flip side is true. Some countries' voters are amazingly tolerant of inequality within society, and that would explain the States, and even to some extent the Brits, of course. Let's move on. I'm coming to the end of this short presentation. I've got another handout for you, and it's about Britain's living in relative poverty today. What are the lives like of people living in poverty? I've got my photo handout too for you. Have a look at the images, natter with your partner, talk about those images. What are we looking at here in these images? What are we seeing? How can you explain the images? Did you find any of the images shocking? You know, what do you feel when you see these images of everyday Brits' lives? So there you are, that's your next exercise. Do that before my next video, which is the last in this series. Once again, there's some absolutely great literature, great resources about. I'd like to draw your attention to the Guardian website, which has a society page, often focusing on topics like inequality and poverty. Hope you've enjoyed the video. Thanks a lot. Next one coming up.